Good morning. This is Jason Dean. It's about 9:30 in the morning. It's Friday. So I hope everyone's doing good. Had a unusual way of starting the day today. I I had a gig tonight that was scheduled to be I used to be in a band quite a few years ago called the 220s, and we used to play up in Bangor a lot. We used to play at these different clubs up there. There was a pretty cool scene of clubs. Ipanemas was one, I believe, and then Patty Murphy's. There was Nocturnum, that was another place. And I believe there's one other place I can't think of the name, but there's about three or four clubs up there. And at one point, I was playing in Bangor quite a bit. The band, the 220s, was a rock band I used to play in, and that was we had a good ride for a couple of years, few years where I don't know, we kind of developed a pretty cool fan base, and things were happening for that band. And then I was also playing with the jazz guitar player up in Nocturnum once a month. So I was up in Bangor fairly often. But anyway, so I had a gig booked with a musician who I played with off and on for a couple of years. We had a gig scheduled up in Bangor tonight, and the venues, like I've talked about it in the past, were like the venues. Most of the venues that were gigs this summer and especially last year, about 97% of the gigs were outside. So weather was always an issue, but I feel like we lucked out. We usually luck out pretty well with the weather, and so there weren't too many cancellations due to that reason, because the weather can be really very unpredictable, because it's a coastal area where we live, so we're like right on the ocean. So the weather is all over the place, and you know just all one day you can have a beautiful sunny day, and within an hour it can change to like overcast, and then a storm can blow in because we're on the coastal in the coastal climate. But luckily we didn't have many gigs get canceled this year, so it's but anyway, so I had a show booked tonight with a person who I've played music with a bunch of times. It's usually like fill in. They're usually like fill in gigs, and usually, usually what ends up happening for fill in gigs. Well, typically fill in gigs, like I don't know, like I usually have about five or six bands that I normally play in. I usually play with a band called Quantum, which I talked about many times. That's my own original bass band, and that's my weird little outlet that I have. And then I usually play with another band called Electric Bonfire, which is a really fun band that does all mostly original tunes, and it has a little bit of a jam rock kind of vibe, some psychedelic elements, has a Pink Floyd element to it. But we also mix up different styles with, we have some tunes that are like reggae, in the reggae realm, some funk tunes. We have some tunes that have a jazz kind of vibe. We've been starting to incorporate some tunes that have odd meters, which is a lot of fun, and it's great. We actually have a show tomorrow at Fogtown Brewing in Ellsworth. They have two locations, and it's a brew house I've heard lots of good things about. And they have a location up in Ellsworth, and then also another location up in Bar Harbor. I actually have two gigs coming up at both of those venues. And tomorrow we're playing with Electric Bonfire at Fogtown in Ellsworth, and it's outside, so hopefully the weather's not too bad. It's funny too. We've had two shows. This is our third try of basically having a gig set up there, and they've been getting canceled. We had one canceled due to the pandemic when it was during a lockdown, so we had that obviously got canceled. Then we had another show they were booked, I think it was over the summer, this past summer, and that got canceled because of the rain, because it rained that day. It was a really stormy day. So we have another show this is our third try at the same venue, and evidently it sounds like it's a cool thing. It's going to be a big kind of fall festival thing in Ellsworth, and I guess there's like tents and stuff set up for beer tastings and things like that. And but apparently there isn't like a tent for the band, so which is kind of weird. But so hopefully, fingers crossed, their show doesn't get canceled. But it's our third try there, so I usually play with those guys, and they're awesome. Really a really fun group of guys, and the music's challenging, and it's been with them for a few years now, and it's progressed to where we're doing mostly original tunes. So, and then obviously with Split Willow, I did the show with my buddy Emmett Layler this week, and that band has kind of moved into, over the last few years has evolved to where we're doing much more, original bass material. That band, out of the groups I play in, has been probably the busiest group. We just finished our last gig of the year, just like a week or two ago. We played at another outdoor show for the Art Walk in Camden, and that was great. It was a little chilly, but it was fun. I actually know we played a gig before after that, the week before last, on Halloween. It was a Halloween show, and that was indoors, and that was our last show. So we'll be going back to kind of hibernation mode. We'll be, going back to rehearsals. We've been rehearsing during the week again, and just, forging ahead with getting some new material. And we have this album that's been recorded, and ready, more or less ready to go. So we're waiting to see where that goes, and hopefully we can get that out. But that band's been a lot of fun. Great bunch of guys. And again, it's all, it's over the years, it's moved to doing all mostly original material. And then the other group that I play with, Bone Broth, which is also one of the members of Split Willow with Cara Luzon. That's pretty much her baby. And that band has had a real interesting kind of evolution with like kind of where the trajectory of that band has kind of become, or where it is now, because it was kind of funny because my friend Eric Halsey, who I've talked a lot about on this show, who's an amazing musician, amazing bass player. He just an amazing musician, and I love playing music with him, at any chance I can get. And then there's also Ronnie, or better known as Enor, who's an amazing musician, guitar player, and Cara is amazing too. But it was last summer she had basically put out this idea that she wanted to like put together this band, and she knew this guitar player, Ronnie. She said he's just an amazing musician. He's got this real eclectic kind of way about him, and he builds his own instruments. And so I thought that sounded cool, and she wanted to get Eric Halsey involved. And I played with Eric quite a bit. Played in one band with him, but we mostly have done jamming, kind of rehearsal situations. But we have played a little bit as far as gigs. And she's like, yeah, I want to put together this group, but it's going to be like basically just us improvising. And her boyfriend Matteo Mendoza is a really another super talented guy. He does a lot of rapping and hip hop kind of bass material. So she had this idea of putting together this group, and she booked a couple of gigs where we did these shows last summer, and it was interesting because we never rehearsed, and we did these gigs, and basically we play our first gig. I remember it was like a 3-hour show, and it was at Primo Restaurant in Rockland, which is an amazing place, and we actually just played there this week, a couple of days ago. Yeah, it was a really fun party, an amazing venue. A real kind of a world-renowned restaurant in the area. They have all kinds of write-ups in the New York Times, and just an amazing place. But anyway, so we played like our first gig as a band there, and basically it was 3 hours, a 3-hour slot, and there was no plan at all. It was all like improvised, and she called a couple of tunes that are kind of considered in the vein of like the gypsy kind of world, because that's where she kind of comes out of. She's a fiddle violin player. But other than that, it was all improvised based, and I haven't been in that. In my background, I used to play in a couple of bands that were kind of in that vein. Um, I was in a jazz group with my great friend Mike Whitehead, who I've talked about, who is the bass player in Quantum. You know, we've played together in a bazillion different combinations over the years, and he's just such an amazing musician and guy and friend, and always have that connection with him. I always look up to him as a teacher. I always refer to him to people as like my Obi-Wan Kenobi. But we had a jazz group for a while, well, a few different jazz groups over the years. One of our first groups that we had was a this this jazz trio that was kind of all improvised. There used to be another amazing musician, bass player, Doug Dietrich, who used to live in Belfast. He's from New Orleans, and he is a musician that came out of the church from down south, playing in the church down in Louisiana, and his whole family they're fabulous musicians. And he moved here, and this is quite a few years ago, but he had moved here, and he lived here for a few years, and we ended up playing together. The two of us started playing with Mike, and we at first it started out with that band where we were the house band for this jazz jam, and this jazz jam used to happen at Rock City Coffee down in Rockland at their original location, and we used to be the house band for that. And basically, it was a jazz jam, so people would come and sit in, and different configurations of people, and it was great. And then after we did that for a while, Mike had this idea of putting together this band, and it was just a trio. And so we started to play gigs, and we started to be active as a band. And that group was interesting too, because it was all we did maybe one or two like songs or jazz standards. When I mean jazz standards, things like for example, Satin Doll or Girl from Ipanema, like tunes that are in like this thing called the Real Book, which is a collection of a lot of these classic jazz tunes or standards. And we used to do one or two of those kinds of things, but mostly Mike wanted the band to be, kind of modern sounding, but very much improvised. So we started playing a lot of gigs where we were just doing these totally improvised sets, and it was a lot of fun. It was a lot of, it relied so much heavily on kind of listening as a musician and trying to really, pick up on what was going on, and communicating in that realm. And that was a really great eye-opening experience, because that group was totally improvised, and that was years and years ago. Um, but it was a big learning experience, and I always loved. And some of the stuff we did would be, I don't know, kind of considered to be like avant-garde jazz, like real modern stuff. Um, but it was a big eye-opening workshop kind of experience. But actually, even before that, I used to play, and actually Mike uh, had a big history with her. He used to play. Mike originally used to play with this really amazing piano player, Marion Driscoll. He was an, he was a regular member of her band, and it's funny because I remember one of the first times I came up to Maine, um, his group, the Marion Driscoll group, was playing at the Camden Opera House, and it was one of the, I kind of remember it being as one of the best concerts I'd ever been to. I was pretty new to like listening to this real wild kind of frenetic jazz, and it was all like improvised, and it was really beautiful, serene, and melancholy and ferocious. It had just so many different shades to it, and it was all improvised. And it was the first time I'd really seen that kind of thing, and it was really amazing. And I even to this day, I remember that concert as being one of the the best shows I ever went to, and it was just, I was kind of blown away by it. And Mike had a big part in her band, and they were doing really really well for a long time, and they even went to Europe for a while and toured. They played all kinds of shows here in Maine for quite a few years. But they went on tour and they went over to Europe for a while and they played a bunch of shows. Like they were doing really really well. So and then fast forward a couple of years after that, I'd gotten a call from Marion Driscoll about playing a show with her, and I had never played with her before, and I was like, wow, like that could be cool, like that could be fun and interesting. And I started to know a little bit more, and I used to go see Marion Driscoll quite a bit at that point when Mike was with her, and I realized like she was a pretty big deal. You know, she's when she was younger, she had a couple albums out in on some fairly well known jazz labels in New York. She used to collaborate with Cecil Taylor in New York, and she was a pretty well respected figure in like the kind of the world of the avant garde jazz movement in the 70s and 80s in New York. She went to Japan for a while and played a bunch of shows earlier in her career, and so I jumped at this opportunity to play with her, and I played this private party, and I remember it being just this crazy weird experience. There were all these people that were it was this party where there was this group of all of these kind of wealthy people from out of town, and she basically wanted us to play, you know, this whole improvised thing. And you know, it was all total, you know, I was totally, you know, it was by the seat of my pants, and I just, you know, I did it, and it was a great experience. But being with getting back to Bone Broth was kind of like in that vein. And I thought that that group was going to be just like a one-off kind of thing. And then after we played about 3 or 4 shows, Carr started booking more and more shows. And then we recorded one of our shows. One of the shows that we had done, this one concert, was recorded. And then fast forward a few months after that, and she decided that she really wanted this to be the Bone Broth. She wanted it to be a regular band. So it evolved to that. And just recently, we just put out an album, which was a nice surprise of one of these shows that we did. And I was, you know, I was really excited, and I'm pretty proud of how that whole thing came about, and pretty happy with the album. So we just recently came out with an album with that band, and now it's a regular band where, you know, we just played a gig this week, and we just booked a few more shows that will be coming up, and that's been a lot of fun. It's been a real big challenge, and they're you know, and I feel real fortunate to be playing with them because they're pretty amazing musicians. So that band is fairly busy, and then I have another band, Complexity, which is a more of a jazz fusion kind of band, and that's all original material. And that band has been more active the last year or so. We've been playing more. We've been mostly playing in Portland we have a residency at Blue, and we're starting to play at a few other places. And we're actually going to be going to New York in March. There's there's a small independent record label in Brooklyn, New York, that's interested in putting out some of our music. So we're going to be going to their studio and record some songs for them, and they're going to put our music out on vinyl. So stay tuned for that. That's going to be a very exciting thing to get to be involved in, and to see where that goes. So that'll be really cool. And you know, and again too, it's like every now and then somebody will say, like, a friend, or I don't know, somehow will come up. Somebody will say, "Well, like, what's your favorite thing out of the things that you do, and that you love doing the most?" And oh, and the other group we have, I also have a jazz group, which which is called the Whitehead Dean Group, which is me and Mike, another group that we have with Mitch Markowitz on guitar and Glenn Dubois, and that band that's a little bit more of a modern bass band. We do some jazz tunes. It's mostly Mike's tunes. We do a lot of improvised kinds of things, lots of gigs or tunes, and we usually play during the summer. We have been playing. We played a lot more this summer at Lulu's along with Quantum. So that band's a really fun thing. I really enjoy that group a lot. So, and as far as, like I mentioned, pickup gigs are usually things of where, you know, you kind of get, as a musician, you might get, you know, a last minute call to fill in for somebody, or somebody will say, "Hey, are you interested in playing this gig, so and so?" And there might not be a rehearsal involved, or it could be, a lot of the times when you get calls for fill-in gigs or pickup gigs, they're fill-ins for like that band might have about 5 or 6 different drummers or musicians that they pull from, so they'll call you if you can do this date, and a lot of times there's not any like necessarily, you know, rehearsal involved. So it's just kind of like you kind of go into it, and sometimes it can work, sometimes it doesn't. It's like any gig, like sometimes you have really good gigs, and then sometimes you don't, But usually, if your usually if your show or the band that you're, performing with, obviously the more rehearsed it is, the better it will be. And even that being said, you can have your off nights or whatever. But I always think of like the analogy of like, like I talk a lot about people that I love and, you know, look up to, and I think of, uh, and I talk a lot about Miles Davis Quintet, probably my favorite jazz group, and one of my favorite groups of all time. I think of like, Miles Davis on trumpet, Wayne Shorter on sax, Herbie Hancock on piano, Ron Carter on bass, and the legendary Tony Williams on drums. And I listen to their music, all the time, and studio albums and their live stuff. And I always think of like, you know, they probably had off nights, and I've heard about guys where it's mostly been centered on people who have done reviews of their live performance. But there was one guy who had written this review years ago about seeing that band in New York, and he was saying how they were like having an off night, or they were, the Tony Williams was playing too loud, or blah blah blah, and I just thought it was funny, and and I remember there was a response or something from Tony Williams. It was actually Mike Clark, who's one of my all-time favorite drummers. He was talking. He became friends with Tony Williams, and he took a lot of the ideas that Tony Williams kind of created, and adapted it to his own playing. And he was like, they were having a conversation about this guy who basically said Tony Williams was like playing too loud, drowning out the band at this one concert, and this guy was writing like a concert review in New York in like this 60s or 70s. And he was saying how Tony Williams was drowning out the band, he was too loud, and all this kind of stuff. And Tony Williams, his like reply to that was like, "Well, I play drums, and drums are meant to be played loud," and that was all he said. And I just thought that was pretty badass. Um, but I think of like, even guys at that level where they have, I'm sure in their own crazy way they felt they had their off nights, where they felt like they weren't nailing it. Um, and and then also like I think of myself, um, where if I'm playing a gig and it's a longer gig, like I always have a hard time right from the beginning of being able to be in that space, or step into that space right away and be on 11 at that point. Whereas, and there's moments I've had that experience, the moments at gigs, and it's always very fleeting, and it's very small, of where I feel like, oh, okay, like kind of in the zone, or things are kind of taking off, and you're in this interesting space of where you're not really uh, being conscious of what's happening, and you're just reacting. And it's an amazing space, and it's very, I don't know, it's kind of like a transcending experience in some ways. But and it's that feeling that I've gotten from like, if you see a movie or you read a book, or some kind of literature, and it just captivates you, and it takes you away, and you're in that zone. And for me, it's like I've played music for a long time, and I kind of always look at it as this constant evolution, hopefully. And I feel like I've had that experience a few times, where that's happened, but it's very very small when I think of considering how relatively how long I've been playing, but it's been very, on that level of experience of having that kind of feeling. I feel like for me, it's always been pretty small and minuscule, but it's enough to where it's inspiring and it keeps me wanting to pursue this weird thing that I do. But when I think of like, like when basically musicians talk about being in the zone, but I think of like the caliber and the level, like say the Miles Davis Quintet was at. They were on stage and everything that they did, they were in that zone all the time. Like they were. It wasn't this like they would do this for hours on end, and they would be in that space constantly. And to me, that's because of their ability, their high level ability, and to me, that's like the most kind of inspiring thing to strive for. So, so it's always an interesting kind of process of that. But anyway, so pickup gigs are things where you're not typically there's not a lot of times it's not you're not in a situation where you can rehearse, or they could be very last minute. So I had a show that was booked tonight with somebody I've played a few gigs with, and there wasn't going to be any rehearsal. It was going to be a little bit more seat of my pants kind of thing, and having to really like okay watch who's counting who's counting off the song, really being careful of that and mindful of all those little things because there's no rehearsal. Um, but we had a show tonight, and it was canceled due to rain, which is so strange. I guess there's like these storms coming, and this one venue, which was inside, or the gig was inside, they canceled the gig because of rain, and I just thought that is one of the strangest things that I've heard. So it is what it is, um, but getting back to some more film stuff, I'm going to be actually filming a show today, which I'm pretty excited. And probably in the afternoon, I'm going to be filming another interview segment for Film Fanatic, and it's going to be with my mom. And I had mentioned this before, that I had this idea last weekend about maybe doing a show where, it came up during this conversation with a couple of friends and my family. We had gone out to dinner, and it started off as a joke. And then I was like, and then later that night, I was like, you know what, that kind of makes sense. Like, that could be fun because not only is she, uh, the person who brought me into this weird world, um, but she also brought me into the world of films. I mean, you know, she was my introduction to my love of film, and that's how it started. So I thought about it for a day or two, and then I was like, you know what? It's kind of a silly, kind of goofy thing to have, as happen maybe in reality. But then I thought, you know what? On paper, it totally makes sense because that's how I got into horror. I got into horror through her love. She always loved and still loves a lot of the old slasher films. Friday the 13th, Nightmare on Elm Street. She's really into the Final Destination franchise. Her favorite, thing is probably, or filmmaker, is Alfred Hitchcock. I remember always, it's, my memories is my earliest memories are of watching like The Birds or Psycho or Rear Window on cable or TV or VHS, and it was Hitchcock. And I remember that was like literally my first exposure to film, and that's what got me hooked to where it started to where I am now. And so I thought, and we still watch a lot of horror films together. So I thought, why not? I think that would be really cool. A lot of the films and things that we did, she'd take me to the movies a lot. We'd go to see the Friday 13th movies in the theater. In the movies that she would let me watch, I think in this different day and age now, I think a lot of parents probably wouldn't let their kids watch some of these films because it's not age appropriate. But it was a different time, and she let me watch just about everything and anything, so it was cool. So she's gonna be, um, she's gonna be on the show, and we're gonna do an interview later on today. So stay tuned for that. That should be interesting. So this brings me to the show that a show about this movie. I did a review about this movie back when I was doing Facebook Live videos on my Facebook page, and now that I've made this transition to do all videos on YouTube, I was like, I need to do this movie. And again, I want to thank everybody. It's been really great. I've noticed that a lot of the videos now are in the thousands range as far as views, and really appreciate the support and growing and helping with this whole like crazy thing to continue to grow and to reach a bigger audience for a lot of these pretty obscure weird movies that I cover, and I really appreciate it, and that it means a lot, and it's just fun. So this movie, Maniac, this is, I would have to say, this film, this came out in 1980. It was directed by William Lustig, and it was written stars, written by and stars Joe Spinell, the legendary Joe Spinell. And this came out in 1980. This was a movie I remember as a kid. I remember seeing this on back in the days of VHS. Fast forward many, many years, I bought this recently, about I think it was about 2 years ago, when I started getting really heavy duty into buying Blu-rays. I started checking out. I discovered a couple of guys on YouTube that were talking a lot about these kind of horror exploitation movies and a lot of the reissues. Blue Underground, Vinegar Syndrome, Severin, Mondo Macabre, Scream Factory. Those are a list of like all the companies. I'm probably leaving out one or two, but that's a general list of all the companies now that are reissuing and these really amazing packages of these restored exploitation horror movies, and it's just amazing. Like all the great Italian horror films, all the other films that have come out throughout Europe, and also lately I've been getting some really great Spanish films, some French films, all in this kind of world. I've been beefing up my Lucio Fulci collection, my favorite Italian director. I mean, and there's so many other great directors in that world, and also a lot of amazing American directors at that time. William Lustig, for instance, Herschel Gordon Lewis. Just a huge amount of great filmmakers for this style. And a couple of years ago, I was finding out, checking out these guys on YouTube that were doing these really great reviews for a lot of this stuff, and I came across one of the guys talking about Maniac, and I was like, oh yes, I remember this movie. I haven't seen it since I was a kid, and I'm like, oh my god, to get this on Blu-ray would be sweet. And he had talked about, it was Moods, who I've talked about, this guy Moods, who is he's a film reviewer, and he's a Canadian. We won't hold that against him. Who specializes in a lot of this kind of stuff, and this was like his, pretty much his top, one of his top movies. He talks a lot about, but he would do a lot of great shows on. He's done a lot of great shows on Bill Lustig, the director. Bill Lustig is also well known for doing Maniac Cop, which is another classic, and Maniac Cop 2 and 3, which I have that movie on Blu-ray, and I'll eventually do a show on that. He's one of my favorites. But Maniac, he was talking about how Maniac was his favorite, and I have to say, it's the same for me. This is my all-time favorite slasher horror exploitation movie of all time. It's so low budget. It's so incredibly gritty. It was all shot. It came out in 1980, and it was right at the height of that amazing yet seedy period in New York City on 42nd Street, when grindhouse cinema was the thing, where basically there were all these old theaters that were run down that showed tons and tons of all of these glorious exploitation movies from Europe and America and Italy and all around the world. And this film really takes a look at that, and it feels like you're there, because it was filmed during that time. So this film is so incredibly gritty. It's so dirty. It's pretty disturbing. Um, and the thing that's so amazing about this movie, Tom Savini, I've talked about Tom Savini. This was like the movie, one of the biggest movies that he had ever worked on, and it's just amazing. Like all the in-camera gore effects. It's got some of the best gore ever captured on the big screen. Some of the best kills. I think the best kills. And I love slasher films are probably my favorite part of this world, or if you want to call it the subgenre of like the horror exploitation world. Slasher films are my favorite, and if I get a hold or and watch a good slasher film from that period, that's all I need. Like to me, it's like entertainment at its highest. And this movie is just so great. The thing that is so amazing about this film is that it's so raw, and there's moments in this film that they're definitely incredibly disturbing and kind of hard to watch. But the story is great. It's basically the story itself is very straightforward. I mean, it's a movie about this guy who's a serial killer in New York, and it's kind of told. The narrative of the story is kind of told from his perspective. And the documentaries on here are really awesome, but there's a lot of great interviews with Bill Lustig, the director, and him and Joe Spinell, who was a really pretty famous character actor. He was in a bunch of movies. He actually was in The Godfather. He did all kinds of films, but they were best friends for a long time, the two of them, and they wrote this story together. Or actually, Joe Spinell wrote the story, and they used to work together all the time. They lived in New York during the heyday of the whole grindhouse world, so they used to go see every movie. I mean, just an amazing period for, in the history of cinema. I would have loved to. I grew up in New York, and I was born in '75, and so I was too young to have seen any of this. I missed all that whole period of New York, but I would have loved to, if I could go back in time. I would have loved to have been able to see movies in New York at that time, especially the grindhouse cinema. Um, but the interesting thing that they were talking about, Bill Lustig was talking about the Jaws had just come out, Steven Spielberg's Jaws, and that was that's an amazing movie, and that movie was commercially a huge hit. So being at what they kind of do in the exploitation world, William Lustig had this William Lustig had this idea of like, well, let's make a Jaws movie, but we'll make it about this guy who's a serial killer. So it's essentially like Jaws on land, and the central character is this serial killer. So they kind of ripped off that idea of what Steven Spielberg did with Jaws, and and also the book uh, Jaws, and so they essentially like took that character of the shark and made it into a man, and it took place in New York City on land. So I thought that was pretty funny. But the thing that is so amazing about this film is just how gritty it is and the atmosphere. It's just like you really feel when you watch this movie, it kind of almost feels like a documentary, but you feel like you're in New York City. And it just has this an incredible atmosphere. And it's generally scary. I think the ending of this film is so completely bonkers, completely and completely insane. And I think you know, Tom Savini is my favorite. He's my man as far as practical effects. Like he's really well known. He did a whole bunch of slasher films in the '80s. Probably most well known for Friday the 13th, the Friday the 13th movies, particularly the first one. And those are all amazing. But Maniac is like to me is like his that was his golden hour, and it's amazing. And definitely, if you're a slasher film fanatic and a horror film fanatic, this is essential. Like this is definitely my favorite of all time. as far as the slasher genres, and it's definitely even outside of that. I would say that Maniac is, even on my list of, quote unquote, uh, favorite movies that aren't necessarily part of a genre. And this would be on my top 10 list of like just generally, it would generally just make my list of like one of my all time favorite movies. So highly recommend it. Maniac, 1980. It does not get any better than this. This movie is sick as hell and just oozes with atmosphere. I had talked about this before, um, you know, where there's a couple of movies where there's one movie right now that is huge, and it's an independent film, pretty low budget, but there's a movie called Terrifier 2, and there was the first one came out about I think 6 or 7 years ago, and the new one Terrifier 2 just recently came out, and it's cool in a lot of ways because especially around Terrifier 2, I've seen the first one, I just saw it recently. Terrifier 2, both films were shot for very, very little money. They're totally as low budget as you can get. And they definitely harken back and they're kind of tributes to, films like this. Films like these super low budget, gritty slasher horror films, exploitation movies that came out in the 70s and 80s. Terrifier is definitely, to a degree, they're both films. I haven't seen the second one, but the first one I would say is definitely like it pays homage to the films like this, and it definitely has some of those aesthetics, but it's obviously shot in a very modern way. It's a contemporary film, but Terrifier 2, which just came out, has made an incredible amount of money considering the budget that it has. But it's also like what I noticed is I kept hearing about these movies, and it's centered on this character called Art the Clown, which is basically this this psychotic clown that is completely insane and murderous, and he just slaughters people for 2 hours. Art the Clown, and it's basically centered on the the brutal killings in the movie for 2 hours. And for the last few years, I've kept, especially recently when the second one came out, which has like went on to become, it's gone on to make an incredible amount of money, which is kind of amazing considering how low budget these films are. Um, but I kept hearing about it and saying how people were saying this is like the greatest. The Terrifier was like the greatest, especially Terrifier 2. People were saying, well, both of these movies are like the greatest slasher movies right now. They're the best horror films. Art the Clown is like the new face of horror. He's like the most iconic character. People were saying, that this movie was like one of the best horror slasher films that's come out in 20 years or so. And they were also saying, well, Art the Clown now is like this new iconic character. He's right up there with like Michael Myers and Jason Voorhees and Freddy Krueger, Leatherface. He's that new guy. He's that new face. So I kept hearing about all of this stuff, all this hype about the movie. So the other night, or it was a couple weeks ago, I finally saw Terrifier, the first one, and it was interesting because I watched it and without a doubt the kills in the movie are brutal, and I liked, like, I'm a big fan of gore and and things all the things that entails, obviously, and that was on that scale, that was pretty satisfying. Like, it's incredibly brutal and just like there were times I remember watching it, and again, this is the first Terrifier. I haven't seen the second one, where I was like, wow, like they actually went there. It was like it was brutal. It kind of reminded me of, well, there's this whole term that's kind of used, or it's been a thing where people say, call certain films uh, like torture porn. Like films like Saw or Hostel and The Human Centipede, like those films. And I've seen all of those films, and they are pretty brutal, and I can kind of understand people saying that. Where basically there are scenes in it where the victims do get tortured for long periods of time, and it can be brutal. Probably out of all of those movies, the most brutal one I've seen is the second Human Centipede. Like, that's a pretty gross and nasty movie. I do like it, and I do like those movies, but it is interesting because at the end of the day, like, some of those films have that as the main selling point. But I think Human Centipede and I think Hostel, the Hostel movies, particularly the second one, they are kind of a cool. They are kind of cool movies. I think they have a little bit more than just, it's not. I don't feel like they're just relying on the kill factor. That's probably the biggest component of those movies. But I think there are things about it that, that give it a little bit more of a higher level. And I'm a fan of the Saw franchise, and I think those are pretty solid movies. I think the franchise is pretty awesome. But that's kind of where the whole torture porn thing has happened. And I've heard that these two movies, Terrifier and Terrifier 2, are kind of looked at as like basically torture porn kind of movies. So the other night, or a couple weeks ago, I watched Terrifier. And like I said, the kills were pretty brutal, and there were times of where I was shocked, like, wow, like they really went there. They really killed this person off in that way, and I was like, wow, like that's pretty intense. Like, that kind of takes balls to go there sometimes. But and I watched the whole movie, and it was, I don't know, an hour and 20 minutes. I thought Art the Clown was a pretty menacing character, and the interesting thing about his character is there's no dialogue. He's like basically a mime, and and I watched the whole movie, and I was like, okay, this is pretty good. Like, I thought it was pretty good. I did enjoy it. I did watch the whole thing. I started it pretty late at night, so I thought maybe I'd be too tired to make it all the way through. But I watched it, and I liked it. And then, I don't know, like, after I watched it, an hour or two went by, and I was kind of like, I just had this feeling like I'd eaten a bunch of cotton candy, and then I kind of felt a little bit gross afterwards, and then I forgot about it. Like, I felt like everything I just experienced, I just kind of forgot about. And then the next day, I was like, there was nothing about the film that I really remembered or anything that resonated with me other than thinking of, like, well, some of the kills. And without knocking the filmmakers, because I think there's definitely some talent involved, particularly around the actor who played Art the Clown, I started to realize the reason I feel like that movie didn't really stick with me, or it wasn't something I was craving to see again, or resonate with me, was that it just didn't really have, aside from the brutal killings of the film, it didn't really have, there was no atmosphere like this, which is just like the minute you put this in, you're transported to, like, New York in the 80s, back when New York was a really shady and seedy, perverted place. You're instantly transported to that before anything happens. I felt like Terrifier I didn't have any atmosphere at all. Like, there was nothing like that. I wasn't transported to a alternate universe. And I felt like a lot of the characters on the screen were just kind of there. They weren't very memorable. And it just didn't really, the story didn't really go anywhere. There wasn't any real tension, or then even the narrative of what story there was. Like, I don't even know if there really was a story. There weren't any surprises. There wasn't any, you weren't taken on any, there was no journey really involved. It was basically just set up for, like, just brutal killing after another, and that was it. And then I kind of felt like, well, if you took away that aspect of the film, of the aspects of Art the Clown, killing all of these people in, like, the most heinous ways possible, there would be nothing to this movie. It would be just pretty empty, and it would be just kind of bland because it didn't have all of those other attributes. And I was like, that's wild. And I thought about that more, and I was like, oh, okay, that's the difference between, for at least, and again, this is a matter of taste, but that's the difference for me between, you know, if comparing something like Terrifier to, say, this classic right here, Maniac. Whereas, like, this movie is super brutal and highly disturbing at times. But if you took those scenes out, like if you took the kills, and there's about five or six, 4 or 5 really brutal kills in this film, and if you took those brutal scenes out of the movie, for say, just for example, this movie would still be engaging because of the pretty well done story, and it's engaging. It's straightforward, but it's pretty fleshed out. It's a Joe Spinell plays an amazing character in it, and he's got this amazing presence. And the film is just so rich with atmosphere that even if it didn't have those kills, I feel like this movie would be amazing, because it has all of those other qualities, whereas Terrifier didn't. But anyway, my favorite slasher film of all time. Check it out, 1980, directed by the legendary Bill Lustig, who also is the founder of Blue Underground. He's not really a filmmaker anymore, but he's moved into. He started a company, Blue Underground, that releases all of these amazing films. So he's still, very much involved with the whole exploitation world. But yeah, Maniac. So thanks again, and we'll see you next time. If you can and desire to, I really greatly appreciate if you can like and subscribe to my little wacky channel. So we'll see you soon. Peace.